In the stifling summer of 1856, deep in the backwoods of Texas, there existed an event that those who held slaves simply referred to as the race. It was no contest. It was a planned slaughter, a bloody diversion for affluent men whose lives of ease, constructed atop the anguish of others, had left them jaded. Annually, under the three-night veil of the new moon, planters journeyed from across the South to Blackwater Plantation, their pockets laden with gold and their spirits utterly devoid of compassion. The rules were as simple as they were savage. At 9 o'clock at night, 10 enslaved men were set loose into the swamp. By 9:15, the hunters rode after them. White men on horseback, carrying rifles, accompanied by hounds trained to rip apart human flesh. Wagers were placed weeks ahead of time. How long would the swiftest endure? How many corpses would the morning light reveal? Whose enslaved men proved the most resilient? Never once had anyone survived the Blackwater race. Over 7 years, 70 black men had been cast into that marshy abyss. 70 men had perished, shot, drowned, torn limb from limb by dogs, or simply consumed by mud and darkness. Their remains fed the alligators. Their identities were erased before sunrise. And the next morning, as house servants scrubbed blood from their masters' boots, life on the plantations resumed as though nothing had transpired. But the 8th year brought a shift. Among the 10 men shackled in the yard of Blackwater Plantation that June night stood one the other bondman called simply Abel. His back bore the map of 200 lashes. His eyes had witnessed his wife and children sold off to faraway plantations. His hands knew only toil and agony. But his mind had been quietly at work for months, engineering something no slaveholder could conceive. While the white men drank imported whiskey and tallied piles of gold coins under lantern light, while they readied their weapons and fed their hounds raw flesh to stir their bloodlust, Abel looked at the 9 men beside him. And they all returned his gaze, for they all understood this night would be different. Tonight, those who hunted would become the hunted. Before we proceed with this gripping narrative, tell me, which city are you watching from? And be sure to subscribe, so you won't miss the upcoming tales. Let's resume. Blackwater Plantation occupied 3,000 acres of untamed East Texas terrain, where pine groves surrendered to cypress marshes and the murky waters seemed to guard untold secrets. Colonel James Whitmore had received the estate from his father, together with 147 human souls he viewed as livestock. But the colonel had wearied of cotton and tobacco. He desired something more thrilling than ledgers and crop reports. That was when he conceived the race. The first instance, in 1849, had been nearly spontaneous, a liquor-fueled bet between Whitmore and 3 neighboring landowners regarding whose bondman could dash fastest through the marsh. By the 2nd year, news had traveled throughout the South. Affluent men arrived from as distant as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their finest steeds, their deadliest firearms, and their most expendable human assets. The affair became notorious in the obscure circles of plantation gentry. Alluded to in gentlemen's clubs, deliberated over cigars and cognac, yet never spoken of in respectable society or before Northern abolitionists. The swamp itself was perfectly suited. Extending 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, it was a tangle of pitch-black water, cypress stumps, patches of quicksand, and predators both scaly and buzzing. A man could vanish there permanently. Many had. Yet while Colonel Whitmore believed he governed every facet of his depraved contest, he had made one grave error in judgment. He assumed the men he cast into that bog were shattered, defeated, too paralyzed with fear and exhaustion to conceive of anything beyond their immediate survival. It never occurred to him they could scheme. He never entertained the possibility they might exchange words. He never dreamed they could unite. And he certainly never suspected that his own household servants, the ones he entrusted to present his meals and polish his footwear, were complicit in the plot. 3 months before the 8th annual race, Abel had been acquired by Blackwater Plantation for $800. He came shackled, his frame gone from weeks on the auction circuit, his spirit presumably crushed by the separation from his kin. Colonel Whitmore considered it a steal, a top-grade field hand for nearly half the going rate of $1,500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Abel's standing as an agitator had drastically reduced his worth. Twice before, at his prior plantation in Louisiana, he had endeavored to flee. On both occasions he was apprehended and disciplined with 100 lashes apiece, the marks crossing his back like a brutal cartography of insurrection and defiance. What the colonel didn't grasp was that Abel had acquired insight from those botched escape attempts. He had learned forbearance. He had learned to observe, to heed, to accumulate intelligence while projecting an image of defeat and collapse. And most critically, he had come to understand that liberty achieved in isolation was no liberty at all, not when it meant forsaking brothers and sisters to chains, not when one's own release was purchased at the cost of others who had aided, sheltered, and concealed you. On his third day at Blackwater, while toiling in the cotton fields beneath the merciless June sun that made the air thick as molasses, Abel caught two overseers discussing the race. They spoke idly, laughing about the prior year's event, about how the wagering pool had climbed to $20,000 in gold coin and currency. About how one man had covered nearly a mile before the hounds caught him and mangled his legs. About how another had attempted to hide submerged in a cypress hollow and drowned after staying under too long. The overseers found it all exceedingly amusing, slapping their thighs and wiping laughter from their eyes. They mentioned that Colonel Whitmore himself had pocketed $4,000 on a bet that no slave would endure past midnight, demonstrating yet again that the colonel understood his assets better than anyone. Abel remained silent. He kept his gaze downward, his hands working steadily through the bowls, filling his sack with the white fibers that bankrolled Southern fortunes. But his thoughts were racing, calculating, retaining every syllable. That evening in the slave quarters, a cluster of crude log huts behind the main residence where the enslaved population lived in conditions scarcely fit for beasts, Abel sat quietly while the other men and women consumed their scant portions of cornmeal and salted pork. The rations were meticulously measured to supply just sufficient nourishment to maintain productivity, yet never enough to quiet the persistent ache of hunger. He paid attention to their exchanges, learning names, connections, hierarchies, the unseen social order that existed beneath the surface of plantation existence. There was Samuel, a powerfully built man who served as the plantation blacksmith, valued at no less than $2,000 due to his specialized abilities in metalwork and repairs. There was Moses, swift and sharp-witted, who looked after the colonel's horses, including a thoroughbred stallion valued at $3,000 imported from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, whose tenure at Blackwater exceeded all others, 15 years of ceaseless servitude that had left him gaunt but perceptive, his worth diminished to perhaps $500 owing to age and visible fatigue. There was Caleb, youthful and vigorous at 22 years old, purchased mere months prior from a plantation in Alabama for $1,200. His youth and power rendered him precious for the most demanding field labor. There was Ruth, one of the household servants, who cleaned the colonel's study and caught conversations the white men believed private. Her value was set at $1,000 despite her ability to read and write, aptitude she carefully concealed, as literacy among slaves was deemed perilous. Abel scrutinized them all with care. Throughout those initial weeks, he spoke little, cultivating an image of quiet compliance, never attracting notice. He labored industriously, never complained, never directly met the eyes of white men, executed every assignment with mechanical precision. The overseers started to let their guard down around him, persuaded that the beatings at his prior plantation had ultimately crushed whatever rebellious spirit he once possessed. They ceased monitoring him so intently, stopped verifying his whereabouts as often. And that was precisely Abel's intention. Invisibility offered a form of liberty, the liberty to observe without being observed, to strategize without raising suspicion. It was Ruth who first reached out. She came to his cabin on a moonless night 2 weeks following his arrival, drifting through the darkness like a phantom. Abel had been reclining on his coarse straw mattress, gazing at the ceiling through openings in the wooden slats, when her silhouette materialized in his doorway. The cabin measured barely 10 feet square, with walls that didn't fully meet the roof and a dirt floor that turned to mire when it rained. 6 men slept there, packed tightly. But that night, Abel was solitary because the others were laboring the night shift at the sugar house. "You plotting something?" she breathed. It wasn't an inquiry but a pronouncement. Abel stayed motionless, uncertain if this was a snare. Occasionally, household slaves reported to the master in return for minor privileges, an extra portion of meat, a warmer covering, a day exempt from work. The masters called them faithful servants and compensated their treachery, while the enslaved called them something else entirely. Ruth appeared to perceive his suspicion. "I ain't no traitor. I been here 6 years. I seen 3 races. I seen 30 men go into that swamp. 30 men never came back. One of them was my brother. His name was Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs got him in the first hour. I heard him screaming from the main house while I was serving brandy to the men, betting on how long he'd hold out." Abel sat up slowly in the faint starlight filtering through the cabin's chinks. He could now distinctly see her face, the animosity smoldering in her eyes like embers, the same animosity he bore in his own chest like a permanent burden. "I heard the overseers talking about you," Ruth went on, her voice scarcely audible even in the stillness. "Said you tried to run twice before at that Mercier plantation in Louisiana. Said you took 100 lashes each time and didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't break. Said you're either the bravest fool they ever seen or the most dangerous. I think you're dangerous. And I think you're plotting something for the race." Abel studied her for a protracted moment, assessing the gamble. Then he nodded once, slowly, committing himself to trust, because without trust, there could be no scheme, no opposition, no prospect. "The colonel keeps his firearms in a cabinet in his study," Ruth said swiftly, as if she had been waiting months to disclose this intelligence. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all charged and primed. The key dangles on a hook behind his desk, right next to his father's portrait. Every night after supper, he downs a bottle of bourbon, sometimes 2 if his day went well. By 10 o'clock, he can barely stay upright. The overseers play cards in the barn until midnight, drinking corn whiskey and wagering pocket change. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but only one handler sleeps nearby in a small room attached to it, and he's deaf in his left ear from a hunting mishap 5 years ago. Abel sensed something stir in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Dangerous, treacherous hope that could prove fatal if you embraced it too fervently. Yet also the sole thing that rendered survival worthwhile. "How many others are aware?" he asked quietly. "Samuel knows. Moses knows. Isaiah's been talking about it for years. But he never had nobody willing to lead. Nobody crazy enough to attempt it. There's others too. Folks who work in the house, folks who move around the property. Maybe 10, 12 people total who'd help if they believed there was a real chance. We've been waiting for someone like you." Over the ensuing weeks, Abel navigated cautiously through the plantation, establishing contact with each individual Ruth had identified. They convened in small clusters, never exceeding 3 at once, always in varied spots to avoid forming a recognizable pattern. In the blacksmith's forge, where the clang of hammer on anvil masked their murmured exchanges. In the tobacco-curing barn, where the dense leaves absorbed sound and carved out shadowy recesses. In the washhouse behind the kitchen, where the splash of drawn water drowned their voices. Each meeting was concise, purposeful, concentrated on collecting intelligence and cultivating reliance. Samuel the blacksmith became indispensable to their strategy. He was a contemplative man despite his bulk, someone who had devoted years to working with metal and flame, comprehending how objects could be molded and altered. He began putting aside scraps of iron, secretly shaping them into rudimentary yet serviceable implements, a blade affixed to a wooden handle capable of piercing flesh, a spike that could be driven through bone, lengths of chain that could throttle or serve as restraints. He labored gradually, cautiously, never appropriating enough material to be observed, never working on the weapons while under scrutiny. Over 8 weeks, he accumulated sufficient armaments for 10 men, stashing them in 3 distinct locations around the estate, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent corrosion, positioned where they could be retrieved swiftly when needed. Moses examined the horses and the property's configuration with a practiced eye. He had dealt with animals since boyhood and understood their conduct, their anxieties, their impulses. He reported that the colonel owned 8 horses, all quartered in the primary stable near the residence. The thoroughbred stallion was valued at more than any 3 slaves combined, and the colonel guarded it jealously, inspecting it personally each evening. However, the other horses were frequently left unattended after nightfall, their stable doors shut but not secured, the assumption being that no slave would dare attempt to steal a horse, as the penalty was death by hanging. Moses also charted the swamp's entry points, identifying which trails led to quicksand and which were comparatively secure. Information gathered over years of retrieving game birds the white men had shot during hunting excursions. He knew where the water was shallow enough to wade and where it abruptly plunged to depths of 8 or 10 feet. He knew which cypress trees had roots you could stand on and which concealed sinkholes that would engulf a man entirely. Isaiah, despite his age and weariness, despite the tremor in his hands from years of grueling toil, proved to possess the most acute memory Abel had ever encountered. He recounted every detail of the previous 7 races, describing the exact timing, the hunters' positions, the routes the fleeing men had taken. He remembered that the hunters always divided into 3 contingents, one circling left around the swamp's perimeter, one circling right, one driving straight through the center in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side of the swamp, where the ground was firmest and allowed them to gather speed. He remembered that the colonel himself never entered the swamp. Instead, he watched from a raised platform near the starting point, a wooden structure about 8 feet high that afforded him an unobstructed view of the initial pursuit. From that platform, he collected bets from latecomers and distributed winnings to those who had correctly predicted survival times and methods of death. Last year's race had drawn 17 plantation owners with a betting pool of $23,000 in gold and currency, the largest sum yet amassed for the event. Ruth continued to serve in the main house, listening to every exchange, perusing every letter carelessly abandoned on the colonel's desk, observing the patterns and routines of the Whitfield family and their visitors. She discovered that this year's race was scheduled for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon, when darkness would be absolute and the hunting most demanding. She discovered that invitations had been dispatched to planters across 5 states, each one hand-delivered by trusted servants. She discovered that the colonel had boasted to his peers about obtaining fresh stock, including a troublemaker from Louisiana who was certain to provide exhilarating sport, a clear reference to Abel himself. She discovered that the entry fee for hunters had been increased to $500 per night, with all proceeds funneled into the prize pool, rendering this year's event potentially the most profitable yet. The colonel anticipated this year's race would be the largest yet, perhaps drawing 30 participants and a betting pool exceeding $40,000. But most crucially, Ruth learned something the colonel had mentioned casually over dinner one evening, something he deemed inconsequential, yet which fundamentally altered Abel's strategizing. This year, for the first time, the colonel planned to permit the selected slaves to spend the afternoon before the race unchained, to let them cultivate hope before crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological torment would enhance the entertainment, that men who spent hours contemplating possible escape routes would run harder, struggle more desperately, provide superior sport for the paying audience. The concept had originated from one of his guests the previous year, a plantation owner from Mississippi who claimed extensive experience in managing slave psychology for optimal performance. When Ruth reported this to Abel, he smiled for the first time since arriving at Blackwater. It was not a pleasant smile, not the smile of happiness or joy, but the smile of a man who had just been handed the key to his enemy's destruction. "That's when we move," he said quietly. The plan crystallized gradually over the following weeks, refined through scores of whispered discussions, tested against every possible contingency they could conceive. They would not attempt escape during the race itself, which is what everyone anticipated, what every slave before them had attempted. They would not flee blindly into the swamp where terrain and trained hunters gave all advantage to the white men. Instead, they would invert the event, transform the hunters into the hunted, exploit the disorder and darkness to their benefit, and retaliate with a ferocity that would reverberate across the South for generations. Yet they required more than weapons and coordination. They needed individuals willing to perish if necessary, willing to battle against insurmountable odds, willing to sacrifice individual survival for collective vengeance. They needed men who had arrived at the juncture where death held no terror because life had become indistinguishable from death, where the sole remaining choice was between dying like livestock or dying like warriors. Abel approached each candidate personally, usually late at night, always in private. Caleb was first. The young man from Alabama had been selected for the race, chosen because of his youth and vigor, qualities the colonel believed would ensure thrilling sport, a man who would sprint far and fast before being brought down. When Abel disclosed the plan in full detail, withholding nothing, Caleb's eyes expanded with a blend of dread and something else. Something that resembled hunger. "You talking about killing white men?" Caleb breathed, the words barely forming on his lips. They'll hunt us forever. They'll kill everyone on this plantation. They'll make an example that'll be remembered for 100 years. They're going to kill us anyway, Abel replied calmly, stating it as straightforward fact. You've been selected for the race. You understand what that means. You got maybe one chance in 100 of seeing sunrise, and that's if you're lucky. Most men don't last 2 hours. The record is 3 hours and 40 minutes. Set 3 years ago by a man named Joshua, who made it almost to the western edge before the dogs cornered him against a ravine. They say he fought the dogs with his bare hands for 15 minutes before a hunter shot him in the head. That's the best anyone has ever done. 3 hours and 40 minutes of terror before dying. Is that the death you want? Caleb was silent for a protracted moment, his hands trembling faintly. Then he nodded slowly. I'd rather die fighting than die running. I'd rather take some of them with me than just be their sport. Abel discovered comparable determination in the others. There was Thomas, a field hand who had watched his wife sold away 3 years earlier, her price of $900 used to settle the Colonel's gambling debts after a poor night of cards in New Orleans. Thomas had attempted to purchase her freedom, had begged the Colonel to sell him instead, had offered to work double shifts for the remainder of his life. The Colonel had laughed in his face and sold the woman to a brothel in Mobile. There was Benjamin, who bore scars on his arms from a punishment that had involved holding hot coals for speaking back to an overseer, a torture that had permanently damaged his hands, diminishing his value but not his animosity. There was Elijah, whose son had been beaten to death at age 12 for stealing an apple from the Colonel's orchard, his small body valued at nothing in the plantation ledgers, his murder recorded simply as disposed of damaged property, with no further explanation or consequence. There was Marcus, who had been separated from his mother at age 8 and sold at auction in Charleston for $400, who could still remember her screaming his name as he was loaded onto a wagon. There was Joseph, purchased just a year ago for $1,000 after his previous owner went bankrupt, who had been a house slave at a relatively comfortable plantation before being sold to the brutal conditions of Blackwater. Each man had a narrative inscribed in scars and bereavement. Each man had reached the threshold where death held no more dread than life. Each man was prepared. By late May, they had 10 men committed to the plan. They had weapons hidden in 3 separate locations around the property. They had detailed knowledge of the swamp, the timing of patrols, the habits of the overseers. They had Ruth and 3 other house slaves ready to assist from inside the main house, to drug food if necessary, to unlock doors, to create diversions. They had Moses ready to handle the horses, to scatter them at the critical moment. They had Samuel ready to break the locks on the ammunition storage if the opportunity presented itself. What they didn't have was any guarantee the plan would succeed. There were too many variables, too many things that could go awry. A single betrayal would condemn them all to torture and execution. A single error, one instant of hesitation or panic, could unravel everything. The margin between triumph and catastrophic failure was razor-thin. Abel lay awake at night scrutinizing every detail, seeking vulnerabilities, rehearsing scenarios in his mind. The burden of responsibility pressed upon him like a physical weight, like carrying another person on his back. These men were entrusting him with their lives. Their families, the other slaves on the plantation, everyone was at risk. If he failed, if the plan collapsed, the repercussions would be measured in blood and screams. The Colonel would make examples that would be discussed for decades. Public torture and execution designed to crush any notion of resistance anywhere in the South. But if he succeeded, if they actually pulled this off, they would strike a blow that would echo far beyond Blackwater Plantation. They would prove that enslaved people could fight back, could organize, could defeat their oppressors despite overwhelming odds. They would create a story that would spread from plantation to plantation, whispered in fields and cabins, sung in coded spirituals, carrying a message of resistance and hope to thousands of people who lived without either. On June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his official selections for the race. He gathered all the male slaves in the main yard, walking among them like a man choosing livestock at market, examining muscles and teeth, inquiring about stamina and speed. He selected 10 men, calling out their names one by one with casual authority: Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 others who were not part of the conspiracy, who knew nothing about the plan. Simon, David, and Jacob. Abel's heart plummeted like a stone in water. 3 men who knew nothing. 3 men who would panic when the plan unfolded. 3 men who could ruin everything through ignorance or fear or simple bad luck. That evening he approached them separately, taking an enormous risk. Simon was 35, a quiet man who had been at Blackwater for 8 years, who kept to himself and rarely spoke. David was 42, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident in the lumber mill where a saw had caught his hand, an injury that had reduced his value by $300. Jacob was barely 19, newly purchased for $1,100 from a plantation in Mississippi, still raw from being torn away from his mother just weeks earlier. Abel told them everything. He laid out the entire plan, the weapons, the timing, the coordinated assault, the risks. He explained that they had 2 choices: join the conspiracy and have a chance at freedom and revenge, or run blindly into the swamp and die like the 70 men before them, their deaths entertainment for wealthy men who would forget their names before breakfast. Simon listened carefully, his face revealing nothing. Then he asked a single question in a voice steady as iron. "You really think we can kill them all?" "No," Abel answered honestly, because lies would help no one now. "I think some of us will die. Maybe most of us, maybe all of us. But I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running like an animal while they place bets on how long I last." Simon thought for a moment, weighing possibilities. Then he extended his hand. "I'm in. Been waiting 8 years for a chance like this." David was harder to convince. He was older, more cautious, worn down by years of brutality that had taught him the futility of resistance. "Even if we kill everyone here," he said slowly, "they'll send the army. They'll send bounty hunters. They'll track us to Mexico if they have to. They'll make it a national cause. Proof that slaves can't be trusted. Justification for even worse treatment everywhere." "Maybe," Abel agreed. "Probably. But at least we'll die as men, not as property. At least we'll make them pay a price. At least somewhere some other slaves will hear about what we did and know it's possible." David stared at his mutilated hand, the 2 missing fingers a permanent reminder of how little white men cared about black bodies, how easily they discarded and damaged human beings in pursuit of profit. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'm in. Got nothing left to lose anyway." Jacob was the biggest risk. He was young, scared, still harboring illusions that compliance might earn mercy, that being a good slave might result in decent treatment. But he was also angry, still raw from being torn from his mother and sold like cattle. Abel gambled on that anger, on the freshness of his wounds. "They paid $1,100 for you," Abel told him quietly. "You know what that means. You're expensive property. Valuable prime stock. But the moment you step into that swamp, you stop being valuable. You become entertainment. They're going to shoot you for fun like you're a deer or a rabbit. Your mother sold you thinking at least you'd live, at least you'd survive, even if she never saw you again. You want to prove her wrong. You want to die for their amusement 3 weeks after she said goodbye." Tears rolled down Jacob's face, but his jaw was set. "What do I have to do?" Now they were 13. 10 who had planned for months, and 3 who had been compelled to adapt instantly. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to suffice. The final 2 weeks passed in excruciating slowness. Each day stretched out endlessly, the plantation buzzing with preparations for the race. Carriages began arriving daily, bringing wealthy men from across the South. They came with servants, with hunting dogs on leashes, with expensive rifles in leather cases. They filled the guest quarters in the main house and overflowed into tents erected on the lawn, creating a temporary village of wealth and privilege. The smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke hung over the property constantly. At night, lantern lights spilled from the main house windows as the guests drank and gambled and told stories about previous hunts, about slaves they had killed, about the entertainment value of human suffering. Ruth reported the names she overheard while serving drinks. Richard Beaumont from New Orleans, a sugar plantation owner worth over $200,000, who owned 3 plantations and over 400 slaves. Henry Caldwell from Alabama, who owned 4 plantations and nearly 600 slaves, who had built his fortune on cotton and cruelty in equal measure. William Preston from Georgia, who had won $3,000 at last year's race by correctly betting that one slave would survive past midnight but not see dawn. Thomas Ashford from Mississippi, who had brought 12 dogs and was offering side bets of $100 per dog on which animal would draw first blood. Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, who owned a slave trading company and had personally auctioned over 15,000 human beings in his career, separating families and selling children with the casual efficiency of a man selling livestock. These were not poor men struggling to survive. These were not desperate men driven by need. These were the wealthiest, most powerful members of Southern society. Men who shaped laws and controlled governments. Men who sat in state legislatures and congressional seats. Men who considered themselves the pinnacle of civilization while organizing hunts of human beings for entertainment. They saw no contradiction in attending church on Sunday and betting on how long a man could survive being hunted on Saturday. The betting pool grew larger than any previous year. By June 14th, it had reached $52,000 in gold coins, banknotes, and promissory notes from banks across the South. The colonel displayed it in leather bags on a special table in the main house, arranged like trophies for all the guests to admire. $52,000, more money than any slave would see in 10 lifetimes of labor, more money than most white men would earn in 20 years of work. All of it wagered on human suffering. The slaves working in the main house reported that the guests were particularly excited this year. They spoke of fresh blood and new sport. They discussed strategy for the hunt, debated the best positions, compared weapons. They fed the dogs raw meat and let them go hungry for 2 days before the race to sharpen their hunger and aggression, to make them more vicious when released. On the morning of June 15th, the selected 13 were separated from the other slaves and taken to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. As promised, they were kept unchained, though 4 armed overseers watched them constantly from a raised platform. They were given extra food, cornbread and actual meat, a mockery of kindness designed to give them energy for running. The white men wanted good sport. They didn't want their prey to collapse from exhaustion before the entertainment began. Abel used the time to review the plan one final time with the others, speaking in voices too low for the overseers to hear. They huddled in a corner of the pen, their bodies blocking the view, their words carried away by the afternoon breeze. Samuel would be positioned near the eastern edge, where he had hidden 3 iron blades wrapped in oilcloth. Moses would head for the western side, near where the horses were tied to a rail fence. Thomas and Benjamin would stay together in the center, where crude spears fashioned from sharpened wood were buried under leaves and mud. The others would spread out in a loose formation, each man knowing his role, each man ready to adapt if things went wrong, which they almost certainly would. The critical moment would come 30 minutes after they were released, when the hunters entered the swamp with confidence high and guard down. The slaves would not be running away in panic. They would be circling back, using paths they had studied for months, positioning themselves for ambush, turning from prey into predators. They think we're animals, Abel told the others quietly. They think we're going to run in panic, make mistakes, die easy. That's what they've seen for 7 years. That's what they expect. So we give them the opposite. We move slow and careful. We move quiet. We use everything we know about this swamp that they know nothing about. And when they come into our territory, when they're spread out and overconfident, we take them apart one by one. As darkness fell across Blackwater Plantation, the guests assembled near the starting point. Dozens of lanterns illuminated the scene, casting long dancing shadows across the lawn. The dogs strained at their leashes, snarling and snapping at the air. The hunters checked their weapons with practiced efficiency, loading rifles and pistols, adjusting sights, preparing for the hunt. The colonel stood on his raised platform, addressing the crowd with whiskey-soaked pride, his voice booming across the assembled wealth. "Gentlemen," he called out, spreading his arms wide. "Welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. This year we have 13 fine specimens for your entertainment. The betting pool stands at $52,000, the largest in our history. As always, bets may be placed on survival time, distance traveled, or manner of death. The prey will be released at 9 o'clock sharp. The hunt begins at 9:15. May the best hunter win, and may we all enjoy a profitable evening." The crowd cheered enthusiastically. Money changed hands as last-minute wagers were made. Someone bet $500 that no slave would make it past the first creek. Someone else bet $300 that the dogs would kill at least 3 men before the hunters fired a shot. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, like a county fair or holiday gathering. The 13 men were led to the starting line by overseers with whips and rifles. Abel looked back at the assembled white men, at their confident faces, at their expensive clothing, at the weapons glinting in the lantern light. He memorized every detail. These were the faces of people who considered themselves superior, who believed they had a God-given right to own and destroy human beings, who built their entire civilization on the principle that some lives had value and others did not. In a few hours, Abel thought, some of those faces would be gone forever. The colonel raised a pistol high above his head. The crowd fell silent, anticipation thick in the air. Then he fired into the sky, the shot echoing across the property. The race had begun. The 13 men sprinted into the darkness, their feet splashing through shallow water at the swamp's edge. Behind them, the crowd roared with excitement. Someone shouted encouragement to their favorite hunter. The dogs howled desperately, straining to be released. But for exactly 15 minutes, the slaves would have a head start. Time to establish distance. Time to disappear into the labyrinth of water and trees. Abel led the group deeper into the swamp, but not at full speed. Running all out would exhaust them within minutes and leave them gasping for breath when they needed to be silent. They needed to preserve energy and stay together. In previous years, the slaves had scattered in panic, each man trying to save himself, that individualism dooming them all to isolation and death. 200 yards, then we split, Abel called back to the others, his voice low but clear. Remember the markers. Remember the plan. They had spent weeks learning this terrain, mapping every feature in their minds. That lightning-struck cypress meant turn left towards solid ground. That cluster of rocks meant safety for 50 feet. That patch of glowing moss meant quicksand that could swallow a man in minutes. Knowledge was their only real advantage against horses and guns and trained dogs. At exactly 9:15, they heard the second gunshot. The hunters were coming. They heard dogs baying, men shouting to each other, the splash of horses entering the water. Now, Abel hissed. The group split into 4 units as planned. Abel took Simon, Jacob, and Caleb with him, circling toward the eastern edge where Samuel had hidden weapons. Thomas and Benjamin moved west with David, heading for the wooden spears. Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah headed north toward the deepest part of the swamp, where horses couldn't follow, where the water was over a man's head and cypress roots created a maze no one could navigate without intimate knowledge. Each group knew their route, their destination, their timing. The plan was for everyone to circle back toward the starting point from different directions, creating confusion, making the hunters think they were chasing fleeing prey when in reality they were walking into carefully prepared killing zones. Abel's group moved quickly through water that came up to their thighs, cold and black, smelling of decay. They could hear the hunters behind them shouting coordinates to each other, the dogs baying with bloodlust, but the sounds were moving in the wrong direction. The hunters were following the obvious trail, the one that led deeper into the swamp in a straight line. They think we're running straight like everyone before us, Caleb whispered, following instinct instead of strategy. Good, Abel replied quietly. Let them think we're animals. They reached the lightning-struck cypress and found Samuel's cache exactly where it was supposed to be. 3 pieces of iron filed into crude blades, each about 8 inches long, wrapped in oilcloth to prevent rust. Abel took one, feeling the weight in his hand, the rough metal grip Samuel had fashioned. He gave the others to Caleb and Jacob. Simon picked up a heavy branch thick as a man's arm that would serve as an effective club. Remember what we planned, Abel said quietly, all of them crouching in the shadows with water lapping at their chests. We don't attack unless we're sure we can win. We pick off stragglers and isolated hunters. We avoid groups. We use the darkness and their own confusion against them. They crouched low in the water, only their heads above the surface, and waited with the patience of men who had spent their entire lives waiting, who understood that patience was sometimes the only power the powerless possessed. The first hunter appeared 23 minutes later, moving alone through the darkness. He was young, maybe 25, wearing expensive riding clothes now soaked and muddy. He carried a rifle that probably cost more than Abel's sale price, a beautiful weapon with silver inlay and a polished stock. He moved carelessly, thrashing through the water, making noise, convinced of his own safety, certain that the prey were ahead of him fleeing in terror and not behind him waiting in ambush. He never saw Abel rise from the water like a ghost made flesh. The iron blade went into his back between the ribs and angled upward toward the heart. The men tried to scream, but Abel's other hand covered his mouth, muffling the sound. They pulled him underwater, holding him down as he struggled, as his movements became weaker, as the life left his body and he became just another piece of the swamp. His expensive rifle sank into the mud, lost forever. "One," Abel whispered, feeling not joy but grim satisfaction. This was justice. Crude and brutal, but justice nonetheless. They moved on carefully, following the edge of the swamp back toward the starting point. They heard gunshots in the distance, then shouting that sounded confused, almost panicked. The hunters had discovered something, probably one of the decoy trails the slaves had prepared. More confusion. More chaos. Perfect. The second hunter they found was older, experienced, moving more carefully than the first. He had a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other, a tactical error that destroyed his night vision while advertising his position to anyone watching. Abel let him pass, staying low in the water. Then Simon rose behind him silently and brought the heavy branch down on the back of his skull with devastating force. The men dropped instantly. They took his pistol and lantern, valuable prizes. 2, Caleb counted quietly. From different parts of the swamp came sounds of violence. A dog yelping, the sound cut short by something brutal. Men shouting in alarm, their voices high with fear. A gunshot, then another, then silence. The other groups were engaging the hunters, picking them off, disrupting the hunt. Abel's group reached the western edge of the swamp and found Moses waiting with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 dead hunters and 2 dead dogs, their bodies partially submerged in dark water. Moses held a pistol he'd taken from one of the bodies. "The horses?" Abel asked quietly. "Scattered them like we planned," Moses replied with grim satisfaction. "Cut through the tethers, fired a shot in the air." They panicked and ran in all directions. Some of the white men went chasing after them on foot away from the swamp. Pure chaos. This was better than Abel had dared to hope. More chaos, more confusion, more hunters separated and vulnerable. "How many total have we killed?" Thomas asked. "At least 7, maybe more," Moses said. "But they're starting to realize something's wrong. I heard them trying to regroup near the center, calling for each other. Then we hit them while they're grouped," Abel decided. "All of us together. One fast attack, then we scatter before they can organize a real defense." They moved through the darkness toward the sounds of men calling to each other, voices filled with confusion and rising fear. The hunters had indeed gathered in a clearing, perhaps 15 of them, lanterns raised high, guns pointed at shadows. They were afraid now, the realization dawning that something had gone terribly wrong with their entertainment. The predators had become prey, and they knew it in their bones. Abel's group circled around them quietly, joined by Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah emerging from the north like vengeful spirits. 13 slaves armed with stolen guns, crude blades, clubs, and stones. 13 men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. They attacked from 4 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault born of desperation and rage and months of planning. The gunfire was deafening, echoing across the swamp. Men screamed. Lanterns shattered, plunging sections of the clearing into darkness. In the chaos and confusion, hunters shot at each other as often as at the slaves. Abel saw the young man from South Carolina, Jonathan Reed, the slave trader who had sold 15,000 human beings, trying to reload his rifle with trembling hands. Abel's blade opened his throat. 15,000 lives ended with one stroke. The fight lasted perhaps 4 minutes, an eternity compressed into moments of pure violence. When it was over, 12 more hunters lay dead or dying. The remaining few fled into the darkness, their courage evaporated, running in blind panic like the prey they had come to hunt. Abel took stock quickly. They had lost Benjamin, shot through the chest in the initial exchange of gunfire. They had lost David, his skull crushed by a rifle butt. 11 men remained standing. 11 survivors out of 13. Back to the plantation, Abel ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Before they can regroup and organize a real defense. They moved quickly through the swamp, following paths they knew by heart, every root and stone familiar. Behind them, they could hear scattered gunfire, men shooting at shadows, fear consuming what remained of the hunting party. When they emerged from the swamp, covered in mud and blood, they found the plantation in complete disarray. The guests who hadn't entered the swamp were gathering their belongings in panic, preparing to flee. Servants ran frantically. Dogs barked. The horses that hadn't been scattered were being hastily saddled by trembling hands. The colonel stood on his raised platform, trying to organize a defense, his face purple with rage and alcohol and dawning terror. "What are you doing?" he screamed at his guests, his voice breaking. "They're slaves. Just slaves. We have guns. We have numbers. We can." He never finished the sentence. Moses shot him from 30 feet away with steady hands. The colonel fell backward off the platform, landing in the dirt with his skull shattered, his blood soaking into the ground he had walked on like a king. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution, brutal and swift and merciless. The slaves had surprise, desperation, intimate knowledge of the property, and the support of over 100 other enslaved people who now saw their chance for freedom. The white men had panic, confusion, greed that made them prioritize saving their valuables over defending themselves, and the fatal arrogance of people who had never truly believed the enslaved could fight back. Some tried to fight. Some tried to run. Some tried to hide in buildings and root cellars. None succeeded. Ruth and the other house slaves joined in, using knives from the kitchen, heavy candlesticks, iron pokers from the fireplace, whatever they could find. Samuel opened the weapons cabinet in the colonel's study, distributing rifles to anyone who could shoot. The plantation slaves, previously uninvolved in the conspiracy, saw their opportunity and rose up. 147 people, enslaved and brutalized for years, turned on their oppressors with a fury that had been building across generations. By midnight, it was finished. 34 white men lay dead, the guests from Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, all the wealthy plantation owners who had come for entertainment, the colonel and his overseers, the handlers and supervisors, all of them ended. The main house was burning, flames climbing into the night sky like a beacon, consuming the grand architecture built with slave labor. The stables were burning. The cotton storehouse was burning. Smoke and fire turned the darkness into hellish daylight, visible for miles. In the colonel's study, before the flames consumed it, they found the leather bags containing $52,000. Abel stared at the money for a long moment, all that gold and paper representing bets on human suffering. Then he picked up one bag and hurled it into the growing fire. "We're not thieves," he said firmly. "We're not property anymore. We're free people, and free people don't take blood money." The others followed his example without hesitation. $52,000, the price of blood, sport and human degradation, burning to ash and smoke. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the survivors gathered in the yard. Of the original 13 selected for the race, 11 remained alive. Of the other plantation slaves, all but a handful had survived the uprising. 143 people, no longer property, no longer slaves, standing together as the sun rose on a new day. They took what supplies they could carry, weapons, food, blankets, tools, anything useful for the journey ahead. They freed all the remaining animals except the horses, which they would ride in shifts. Then they left in small groups, moving in different directions initially to confuse pursuit, all ultimately heading toward Mexico and freedom, leaving behind nothing but smoke and ruins and a story that would spread across the South like wildfire. the Blackwater race never happened again. The property was eventually seized by the state and auctioned off, but no one wanted it. The legend of what happened there, of slaves rising up and slaughtering their masters, made it cursed ground. Local people claimed to hear screams coming from the swamp on moonless nights. The buildings sat empty for years until they finally collapsed from neglect. And in the slave quarters across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond, people spoke in whispers about Abel and the night the hunters became the hunted, about the race that ended with fire and blood and freedom. The story grew with each telling, becoming both symbol and inspiration, a reminder that oppression could be resisted, that the oppressed could fight back, that even the most powerful could fall. Abel and his companions reached Mexico 7 weeks later, after fighting through pursuit by bounty hunters and militia. Most survived to build new lives south of the border. Some returned years later after the Civil War to search for families torn apart by slavery. Some disappeared into history, their fates unknown, their names forgotten, but their actions remembered. But the story lived on. And every plantation owner who heard it felt a tremor of fear, wondering if their own slaves were planning something similar, wondering if they too might one day face the vengeance they had spent lifetimes earning. The Blackwater Massacre killed 34 white men and freed 143 black souls. The financial loss, including property, crops, and human assets, exceeded $300,000. But the psychological impact was incalculable. A crack in the foundation of slavery itself. Proof that the system could be broken by those it sought to crush. And somewhere in Mexico, Abel built a quiet life. Never forgetting the night he transformed from prey to predator. Never forgetting the men and women who fought beside him. Never forgetting that freedom is not given but taken. Paid for in blood and fire and absolute refusal to accept bondage as fate.